7Artisans recently sent me their brand new 50mm T2 Cine lens, so I thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to come down to the dog park with my family and test it out against 5 other cinema lenses. My main run and gun lens is the Sony 24-105 f4 lens, so I'm including that in this comparison so we can see how different all the other lenses look. Next is the Sony 50mm f1.8. This is a super cheap, small and light lens from Sony that is also the only other lens in this comparison that has autofocus. Next up is the brand new 7Artisans Spectrum 50mm T2. Now compared to the last shot, there's just something more magical and special about how this lens renders images. Next up is the Helios 44-2 58mm lens. This is a 40-year-old Russian lens that lots of people really love the look of, as it's got a really unique look. I like how it looks here, but as you'll see in other comparisons, it does have some flaws. I'm also including 2 50mm Sirui Anamorphic lenses. The first is the crop sensor f1.8 version, which has a 1.3 squeeze factor, and the other is the full frame version, which is T2.9 and has a 1.6 times squeeze factor, which is a much heavier lens with a cinema build and is much more expensive. Here's all 6 images side by side. As you can see, the Sony lenses look really good, but they also look really boring compared to all of the other lenses in this comparison. So I think it's definitely worth checking out a manual focus lens if you can to get a more interesting looking image. Now we'll do a blind test so you can see which lens you like best. Charles and I shot a talking head segment of a very good looking man. So check out which image you like the most and then we'll reveal which lens is which. The first shot was the 7Artisans 50mm lens. Next was the Sony 24-105. Next was the Helios 58mm lens, followed by the Sony 50mm f1.8. Then we had the 2 anamorphic lenses. First the crop sensor 1.3 stretch and then the full frame 1.6 stretch. Next up, we'll test the lens flaring. Unfortunately, Charles got such an unflattering camera angle of me that I decided to shoot everything again using my wife. Fortunately, this means we have 2 camera angles to test the flaring of all these lenses. For the Sony lenses, as you'd expect from a photography lens, the sun flaring didn't really become a problem until the sun was practically in the frame. This is really nice because it meant I had really sharp images, but it's also a bit visually less interesting than the other lenses. The 7Artisans lens definitely starts flaring well before the light is in the frame, as you can see here. However, I think it looks great. The Helios lens starts off looking really awesome, but as soon as we got the sun closer to the frame, it just started blowing out of control and this footage became completely unusable. I was surprised how subtle the flares were on the Sirui lenses in this outdoors test. As you'll see on the next indoors test, the flaring actually gets quite wild. Let's see how these lenses look indoors in a small backlit room. As you can see, the f4 lens doesn't really provide enough subject separation for such a small interior space where the background is close to the subject. The Sony 50mm really does a good job here and makes my life easy with the autofocus and lack of flares. The Helios flaring causes the whole image to look incredibly soft and in my opinion is unusable. The 7Artisans lens looks better than the Helios and the Sony lenses in my opinion. The Sirui crop anamorphic often has cool lens flares, but in this test, where the camera was on a tripod, it didn't show the flares. The Sirui full frame anamorphic has ridiculous lens flares, which I love, but I realise some people really don't like the look of. So for this test, I was mainly just concerned with the final image I got from each of these lenses. I didn't care about testing all the attributes of all the individual lenses, like sharpness, contrast, chromatic aberrations, focus breathing, and all of that. I really just wanted to see if I chuck one of these lenses on, does it really differentiate itself from all the other lenses, and what sort of look am I getting? Starting with the 24-105, this is my most used lens. It's just perfect for run and gun. So being able to zoom out to 24, which is quite wide, and all the way in to 105, it's really a versatile lens. I also love the image stabilization that really comes in handy on the FX6 that doesn't have any inbuilt IBIS. However, compared to all of these other lenses, this is definitely the most boring. So I don't mean bad at all, but just the images don't pop as much as some of these other larger aperture lenses. However, the point of this test was to see if these other lenses could really stand out based on image quality to differentiate themselves from this lens. Moving on to the Sony 50mm f1.8, I was actually really surprised by this lens. It's one of Sony's cheapest lenses and it just feels cheap and plasticky and sort of doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. But as you'd expect, moving from f4 on the zoom lens to f1.8 on this lens really made the subject separate from the background, and I was surprised how good the image looked for such a cheap little lens. I was also surprised how well the autofocus worked. Some old reviews of this lens sort of complained about the autofocus a little bit, but it worked perfectly in all my testing with it. Whether there was a person in the frame, a dog, or some other subject, it just always locked on exactly where it should be and didn't do any weird focus hunting or anything like that. There was a little bit of focus breathing, but personally for me, that's not really a problem. I do think there's been some firmware updates that have improved the autofocus on this lens in the last couple of years, so some old reviews might be out of date. As far as usability is concerned, I didn't like this manual focus ring. Not that you would use it much. I presume if you're using this lens, you're probably going to use autofocus and you'll be fine because it's really good at that. But if you're wanting a good manual focus experience, I really didn't enjoy using this. It's focused by wire, so the focus ring isn't actually attached to the lens element, it's just sending electronic signals, so it feels very disconnected and just isn't a nice experience. Also, the focus throw doesn't feel that nice, and there's no manual aperture ring either, and there's also no focus gearings. Not that you would expect it on this lens, but some of the other lenses do have that, which makes attaching a follow focus really nice. This lens takes tiny 49mm filters, which is an uncommon size that I personally didn't have any filters for. However, you could obviously get a step-up ring to get it up to the size of your other lenses, such as 77 or 82mm. If you're looking for a cheap lens with autofocus to do some run and gun videography, I'd highly recommend this, as the images do look really nice with that f1.8 aperture. If you're looking for a more slow controlled experience with manual focus and a bit more pop to the image, I'd definitely look elsewhere. Next up is the legendary Helios 44-2 58mm lens. Now I was super excited to try this lens out because I've heard a lot about it online for a long time, and I was actually considering buying one. After testing it, I think it's a really good lens in some circumstances. So if there's no light sources in the frame or just out of frame, then you can get a really nice image with a really unique look and a beautiful background rendering. However, if there's a light source in the frame or near the frame, the flaring is just out of control. Now I personally thought this would be amazing because I think the more flares the better, it just looks awesome. But after testing out this lens, it's actually gone too far, and I find there was multiple times I was trying to line up a cool shot with a little bit of lens flare in there, but the whole shot was just blowing out. Now I've only tried one copy of this lens, so maybe this is just a bad one or there's something wrong with this lens, but from my experience with this lens, as much as I love flaring, this is too much, which is something I never thought I'd say. However, because you can find this lens so cheap online, I'd suggest checking it out if you are looking for a cheap vintage lens and don't mind the crazy flaring. Usability wise, I also think this was by far the worst lens. So I never really knew what aperture I was at because it's hard to read the markings, so I'd constantly be adjusting the aperture rings to make sure I was shooting wide open. In my personal opinion, I'd much rather use the 7Artisans lens because it's much nicer to manually adjust the aperture and control the focus from that lens, and the flaring isn't as out of control. So that gives me all the vintage and cinema lens benefits without all the drawbacks of this lens. Obviously the 7Artisans does cost a little bit more than this lens though, so that is a consideration. As for the 7Artisans Spectrum lens, this is my first proper cinema lens. Now most of the compliments I'm about to give this lens would also apply to most other cinema lenses, so keep that in mind. Out of all the lenses I tested for this comparison, this was the nicest lens to use and operate. So I really love the aperture ring. It's so easy to see what aperture you're at, and it's so easy to move and adjust, and it stays in position and doesn't seem to move around at all. The focus ring was also the best. It's a long focus throw at 270 degrees, but it just felt nice to operate, and I don't often focus from super close to super far, so the amount of rotation it had felt perfect to easily keep my subject in focus without making it too difficult to do small adjustments. I really loved all the cinema features like the geared focus rings and the standard 82mm front filter thread, but it also just felt really nice and balanced on the camera. So whether I was using this on an FX3 handheld or an FX6 in a bit of more of a built out rig, both times this sort of heavy lens just felt perfectly balanced on the camera and super easy to reach around and operate all the manual focus features. As for image quality, I really love what I'm getting from this lens. So the subject is nice and sharp and really pops out from the background, and I love the way it renders the background. Also, the flaring looks awesome. I honestly thought there was no such thing as too much flaring until I tried out the Helios lens, and heaps of shots were just unusable due to just way too much flaring. So this flares way more than any of the Sony lenses, but I feel like it's the right amount. When I first got this lens, I was shooting my FX6 review, and I used this for some of the B-roll shots, and just the way the flare came out, I was just in love with it from the first time I saw it. You don't get the awesome anamorphic streak lens flares like you would with the Sirui Anamorphic lenses, but aside from that, the flares look great, and it's just a really nice amount of haze where you lose contrast, but it's still enough in there for a nice rich image. At this point, you'd probably be thinking that every compliment I've given this specific lens would also apply to every other 50mm full frame cinema lens on the market, and I presume that you would be right. However, the price of this lens is $379 US, which is much cheaper than any other full frame 50mm cinema lens I've seen. There's some others starting at $450 and they go up to thousands of dollars. Now I'm sure those other lenses are slightly better or much better in some ways than this lens, but this lens gives me everything I need and doesn't break the bank. So I'd highly recommend, if you are looking for a cinema lens, to check this out before looking at the more expensive options. If you're looking for other focal lengths, there's also a 35mm and an 85mm version of this lens. Next up are the anamorphic lenses. So I was really surprised with this 50mm crop lens how good it looked on my full frame camera. I had to zoom in 25%, either using Sony clear image zoom in camera or just zooming in 25% in post to get rid of the darkened edges. But after doing that, I really loved how the image looked, even though it's a crop lens on a full frame camera. I wouldn't let the fact that it's a crop sensor lens turn you off, even if you have a full frame camera, because it's amazingly priced and really comes up great. As for the downsides of this lens, I'd consider it a cinema light lens. So it does have manual aperture rings and manual focus rings, and they are smooth to operate, but they don't have focus gears, and it just doesn't quite feel the quality of the 7Artisans lens or the Sirui full frame anamorphic lens. Having said that, it's still very good, and I wouldn't let that hold you back. I personally added the small rig focus gears to this lens, and even when I'm not using the small rig follow focus, it still gives me a bit extra grip to do manual focus using my hand. Also, anamorphic lenses generally have a pretty bad minimum focus distance. So I've been using a close-up filter on the front of my lens whenever I want to focus closer than its minimum focus distance of about 0.85 meters. Compared to the full frame anamorphic lens, this crop lens is much smaller and lighter, which really helps when you're trying to use it on a gimbal or a slider or some other weight sensitive application. As for the full frame anamorphic, this is the biggest, heaviest and most expensive lens out of all the lenses tested today. And I really love the unique anamorphic lens flares you get when shooting with this lens. This lens has a massive 1.6 times squeeze factor, which means you are getting a normal 50mm vertically, but horizontally you're getting a much wider field of view. So my post-production workflow is to de-squeeze the image and then crop off the edges to get a more normal looking aspect ratio rather than end up with something so insanely wide. Aside from the price and the bad minimum focus distance, the only other problem with this lens is that they only have a 50 and a 75mm version available so far. So if you're looking for something wider than this, like a 35 or a 24, those aren't available yet. However, there is a 35mm lens in the works. As for usability, this lens is a close second to the 7Artisans lens. It does have geared aperture and focus rings, just like that other lens. However, there's a bit more friction to move them, which means it's a bit more effort to start the movement, and so it's a bit harder to be super smooth with your focus pulls. However, that's a minor nitpick. In conclusion, I think there's a massive difference between shooting at f4 with something like this zoom lens and then shooting at f2 like you can with most of these other lenses. I personally love having a bit of detail in the background, so if I'm shooting an interview and I've got time to set up, it's really nice to set up an interesting background. That way you can tell a bit of a story about the subject and really see the subject in their environment rather than just a head on a blurry background. However, when you're doing run and gun, often you don't have the luxury of doing set design and you're just stuck somewhere, and it's much easier to make the subject pop off the background by shooting a large aperture. A large aperture is also an easy way to impress clients who just see the blurry background and think it looks professional. Often I will shoot wide open just to impress the clients. So with the 24 to 105mm lens out of the comparison, we're left with these 550mm lenses. So I'd say if you want autofocus, that definitely narrows your options down. So you've got this Sony 50mm lens or the Sony 55mm or some third-party options, and those would be all great if you're just wanting an autofocus lens, which is really what you need for quick run and gun situations. So if you don't need autofocus, then we're left with these 4 options that are all really exciting and unique. I'd say the first thing to decide is if you want to shoot anamorphic. Now to me, I love shooting anamorphic. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I just love the lens flare. I feel like I'm making a movie, but these are really a unique lens and they're not suitable for a lot of situations. A lot of clients might find the lens flares distracting, or say if you're shooting vertical video, they're not suitable for that. So they're definitely more a niche specialty lens that I mainly use on music videos or sort of more artistic setups. If you are looking for an anamorphic lens and you've only got a small budget, I'd definitely say the 50mm f1.8. However, if you've got a full frame camera and you can spend a bit more, this full frame 2.9 is extra special. I think you'd honestly be happy with either depending on your budget. So if you're looking for a manual focus lens and don't want an anamorphic lens, then that leaves these 2 options. Now I've got the Helios 44mm vintage lens. I thought I'd love this, and I kind of do in a way, but after using a cinema lens, I can't go back to this. Between the awkward manual focus ring, as well as the fact that I can't trust it, if I go out into the sunlight, there's a good chance it's gonna flare so much that I think it's cool, and then go way past that, and just the whole scene's blown out. And it's not just outdoors, even in the studio scene when we had a light in the background, I lost so much contrast, it almost looks like I put a bad filter on the lens. So I think in very controlled conditions, or if you want a unique vintage look, this is the way to go. However, if you're looking for a cheap manual focus lens and you can afford a 7Artisans lens, I'd definitely go this way. The manual focus ring is 10 times easier to work with. It's really easy to see what aperture you're shooting at, and the flares are just right. There's not too much where it just blows out like this, and it's not as boring and clinical as the Sony lenses. Now, everything I've said would also apply to other cinema lenses, so you don't need to look at this lens specifically. However, I'd highly recommend this because every other cinema lens seems to cost a lot more than this. Whether you're looking at the Rokinons, the Zines, or other lenses, they all sort of start at $500 and go up to a couple of thousand, where the starting price for this is $379. I'm sure those other lenses are better, but I'm super happy with this, so this is what I'm going to stick with, and this is what I'd recommend for your first cinema lens. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions or feedback, definitely leave that in the comments section below. If you want to see some more footage shot with this 7Artisans lens, check out my recent FX6 rig video. Most of the B-roll in that video was shot with this lens, and I've labeled it all in the bottom right corner of that video. If you're looking for another comparison, check out the IBIS comparison we did a few months ago, where we compared Sony, Fuji, and Canon cameras to see how they all compare. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.